Good evening. This is the Midnight Bible Study. I want to continue tonight with our discussion of humility. This time I want to talk about being humbled with fasting. So it's a controversial topic for some. It's not easy to be humble in all situations. I mean, one of the things about fasting is it can make us, let me just tell you this, it's the first 4 days of fasting that tend to be the toughest in my experience. But in that time, even the first day might be the worst. When you just feel like desolate and a little bit miserable, and you just know that if you have a little food, it'll make you feel better. So it's tempting. It is a temptation. The temptations comes just like when Jesus was tempted in the desert. When he was fasting, he was tempted in the desert after 40 days. He was tempted, but he fought back with a word. He said, "Man does not live by bread alone." He said, "Get behind me, Satan. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." So I think he's giving us a tool there to, if we're facing temptation, to give up that fast. But before we get into that, why should we fast? What's the benefit of fasting? Well, there are many benefits. I'm sure many people have heard there's health benefits of fasting. There's spiritual benefits of fasting in terms of prayer. But tonight we're just going to talk about the humility of it, being humbled by fasting. So Psalms 35:13 reads, "Yet when they were ill, I put on a sackcloth and humbled myself with fasting." This is King David wrote the Psalms. King David, talk about a guy who is a bigger than life figure, and yet he said, "I humbled myself with fasting when my prayers returned to me unanswered." So why did he do it? Why did he humble himself with fasting? Because his prayers weren't being answered. And so what was his response? He humbled himself with fasting. So perhaps a good time to humble ourselves with fasting is if our prayers aren't being answered and if we're not getting the response, and maybe we need to humble ourselves. Urza 8:21, "And there by the Ahava Canal, I proclaimed a fast so that we might humble ourselves before God and ask Him for safe journey for us and for our children and for all our possessions." So there's another reason why we might humble ourselves with fasting. If we're going to take a journey, we're on some dangerous, perilous path in life, and we need to ask God for a safe journey. We can humble ourselves with fasting. We can call for a fast, whether it's a 24-hour fast or a 3-day fast or longer, depending on where we're at and what maybe pray about it and get guidance in that area. Isaiah 58:3-7 says this is the kind of fast. Now he talks about the story about these characters who would fast and would then be cruel to their servants because they were not, they were somewhat miserable through fasting. By the way, fasting isn't all bad. At some points, it's actually preferable to eating. All right, Isaiah 58:3-7. "Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? It is not the kind of fasting I have chosen to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke." So sometimes it's more than just humbling ourselves, but fasting can be beneficial for breaking the cords of yoke of bondage to, let's say, sin or addiction of some sort. There are different kinds of fasts, and that's why prayer is a good idea. I'm certainly, if you are considering a fast, there's a book that covers different kinds of fast. Elmer, it's not my book. I don't get anything from this, but it's by Elmer Towns, Fasting for Spiritual Breakthroughs. It talks about different kind of fasts and the benefits of spiritual fasts and which ones are appropriate for which kind of situation. But one of the reasons we do this is indeed for to break the cords of yoke. People do fast for that reason. Food addictions, things like that. In the 13th century in Italy, St. Helen Enzalmini lived for months on just the Eucharist. That's the bread and the wine in church. And she was known for her spiritual visions. So that was not a complete water fast. She had the bread and the wine, but it's a pretty Spartan way. And the Daniel fast in the Bible, Daniel it was not a complete water fast that he did, but his plan was to go for 3 years on vegetables alone. It was fasting of all meat. But the king, who wanted him to live a rich and indulgent lifestyle as a new servant, said no, I don't. He thought this was crazy that he would have just vegetables. So he said, look, all right, I'll let you do it for 10 days, and then we're going to compare you with all the other servants and see if you are okay. If you look okay, maybe we'll let you keep fasting. So Daniel ate nothing but vegetables for 10 days, him and his companions. And at the end of 10 days, he was inspected, and sure enough, he not only looked fine, but he looked better than any of the other servants, and it turned out later on that these Daniel and his companions were far more effective spiritually. They were far more effective spiritually than any of the mediums which the king kept handy. And they were living different. They weren't living like these mediums. So now, is this all Old Testament stuff? No. Jesus said unto them, this is Matthew 9:15, can the children of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken from them, and then they shall fast. So Jesus announces that, my disciples aren't fasting now while I'm here, but when I'm gone, after the crucifixion, then they will fast. Maybe they would mourn and humble themselves. Maybe they would fast for some other method and purpose, probably on a regular basis. Fasting is not necessarily a one-time thing. It may be the kind of thing that you do on a regular basis. If you do fasting on a regular basis, and any particularly long fast, anything longer than 3 days, I actually would recommend this book by Paul Bragg. It's called The Miracle of Fasting. I read this book. I read this book, and I refer to it on a regular basis. Anyway, it's a good book, because fasting is something, you don't want to. If you're going to do a long fast, like you may need to, go to a fasting resort or under medical supervision, or not that I've ever done anything like that, but I have the Paul Bragg's book, so I have some guidance, so that's why I recommend it. Fasting is a lot of people have a lot of crazy ideas about fasting, like if you go a day without food, you might die, and just crazy things like this. Even doctors, a lot of doctors don't know the first thing about fasting, because they don't. It's becoming less of a. They're becoming maybe a little bit more educated now, but there's still a lot of doctors who they don't know about it because they don't teach that in medical school. But then there are more, like I said, there are some doctors that certainly, more doctors are learning about it now and maybe getting over their own superstitions about it. But it's far more effective in many cases than medicine, and I'm not giving any medical advice here. But medicine doesn't heal us. The body heals itself. God heals us. The body heals us. And one of the ways that can happen is through fasting. But, we humble ourselves through fasting. And so there are many benefits to humble ourselves with fasting. And it's a good time for prayer. It's a good time to like King David, I bowed my head in grief through weeping for my mother. I went abroad as though for my friend or brother. I bowed my head in grief. It can be something we do in grieving in prayer. For it can do as like Urza, prayer for a safe journey. Like in Isaiah, to untie the cords of yoke. Or like Saint Inzalmidi, for ongoing spiritual closeness to God, and for someone who was a nun, lived months on the Eucharist. So there you go. There's some thoughts on fasting and being humbled with fasting. So there you go. God bless. Good night from the Midnight Bible Study.